think I perhaps should explain for those who aren't fully familiar with the arrangements that have been, or which we have attempted to put in place prior to this hearing, that we had originally intended to see both the Leave groups together on the 25th of February, but it has been a struggle persuading everybody to attend, to put it mildly, and in particular one group's deep reluctance to attend with the other group. And I'm pleased to say that the witnesses we have here today have never expressed any unwillingness to attend the committee, nor sought to attach conditions to their attendance. And I'm grateful to you for accommodating the changes in the arrangements for this hearing and the postponements. I'm looking forward to hearing the evidence this afternoon as our colleagues. I don't think there's much value in spending a great deal of the hearing on what appears to have been the acrimonious history between the two principal campaign groups for leaving, but I do think we need a bit of clarification on a number of the allegations that you in particular, Mr. Banks, have made about them. And perhaps I should just read a few of those out and then ask you to comment on them. You said that their submission to the Electoral Commission was, I quote, full of lies and misrepresentations. You said that Vote Leave are lying and misrepresenting the situation, that these people are jokes, that he, in particular that's Matthew Elliott, wants to be Lord Elliott of Loserville, and that he, Dominic Cummings, is a liability and a danger to both Leave campaigns.
I think you saw his evidence last week.
So I
think that you need to ask that question.
To put it mildly, most of those, and I won't comment on the comment you've just made, do require a bit of substantiation, and I'd be grateful if you'd provide it now.
So which one would you like me to start with first?
You go ahead with whatever.
I think in terms of the Electoral Commission, I think...
Could you speak up? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Do I need to lean forward, or you can
That's
hear me? Yeah,
fine.
sorry. Yeah. In terms of the Electoral Commission, our view of life was always that the Vote Leave bid was the kind of establishment bid, if you like. When we looked at the bid we put forward, which was the full backing of UKIP, Leave.eu had something like nearly 1 million public supporters signed up into it. We had all sorts of different groups representing a very large range of opinion in the Eurosceptic world. And really Vote Leave was a Tory campaign with a few little additions to it, so it didn't really represent the wider Eurosceptic view, and that's how we saw it.
Okay, but that doesn't take us to full of lies and misrepresentations.
Well, I mean, their submission had
what
things
were the
like...
lies?
Well, as a good example, we funded Brexit the movie, which we spent nearly £45,000 putting money into the movie. They quoted it in their submission. They had one conversation where they basically said, if Mr Farage or UKIP are even involved in the project, we won't be involved in it. So that was put in their submission as a fact that they had, helped Brexit the movie to commission the movie and do those sorts of things, where we had actually, pretty well funded 50% of it.
Well,
as one example, I can give you lots of different examples.
I think rather than delay the committee now, it might be helpful if you could set those out in writing and provide them to the committee.
Absolutely, no problem.
With any substantiating...
I mean, there were things like...
With any substantiating...
Yeah, there were things like, for instance, Richard North, who we don't necessarily agree with, but he violently objected to the Vote Leave position, and it was quoted in the document that they had communicated with him and worked with him. Well, we know that not to be the case.
Now, when you say that the process... I haven't actually quoted all the quotes by any means I have in front of me, but perhaps I'll supply one more. You have said of the Electoral Commission's decision, I quote, "We have decided to show the public how this process was stitched up."
Yeah.
So that seems to be an allegation not about lies or misrepresentation by Vote Leave, but about the conduct of the Electoral Commission.
We
I'd be
contemplated,
grateful if you could substantiate that.
We contemplated a judicial review based on a number of facts, but one of them which was there are 8 commissioners of the Electoral Commission, 3 of which excused themselves because they were conflicted. We don't know the reasons why they were conflicted, but one of the commissioners actually voted on the decision that had a conflict relating to vote leave, but because they didn't have enough commissioners to form a quorum, they actually allowed someone to vote that was conflicted. And in the business world, you know, that would be out of the question and pretty reprehensible.
Well, you're subject to, we may decide to take as subject to parliamentary privilege evidence on that point as well. It's a very serious allegation you're making about the Electoral Commission, whose task is to ensure the highest standards in our elections. I have their documentation in front of me here.
Can I make a second point?
Yes, of course.
Well, the second point was that a couple of the prominent vote leave supporters actually communicated via the internet. They won the designation 2 days before the Commission were actually due to announce the result, and I think one of the people that's a very senior member of it actually tweeted out, "Congratulations, vote leave, you've won the designation."
Sorry, a very senior member of
vote leave,
of not a senior member of the Electoral Commission.
No, not of the vote leave campaign. We then wrote to the Electoral Commission by email saying, "What the hell's going on? You're meant to be announcing this Thursday." They then brought forward their decision by a day because they realised the news was out there. And it was clear that the Electoral Commission had either communicated the result prematurely to vote leave or otherwise. But it doesn't give much faith in the confidence when you've got a date where you announce it and then the news is out 2 days beforehand. So call it a stitch-up, call it what you like, but in my book, you know, if there's a process, you stick to it.
It just does seem to have been an extraordinary fratricidal war, tension here between these two groups, bearing in mind you agree on so much.
We agree on quite a lot. There's some things we don't agree on. But if you look at the competition, I would say it's a good Thatcherite principle, sorry for the Labour members of this committee, that competition is good. We raised nearly £9 million for the campaign. We wrote to over 10 million people individually. We sent out leaflets to a balance of another 11 million. So when you talk about the government's in leaflets, our campaign has nearly communicated with the whole country. So we raised £9 million. I think the competition spurred both sides on. That doesn't leave aside the feeling that it was an establishment group that felt they had an entitlement to run the race, and it just become a Tory party cartel, effectively, with a couple of add-on players.
And it was for that reason, therefore, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're saying that your group was unable to form an alliance, a unified group to make the bid.
We wrote 5 times to vote leave to suggest that we should come together, and it was benefiting nobody to have this continuing row. Obviously strong personalities involved in it, but I believe that, particularly with Mr Elliott and Mr Cummins, they believed it was their kind of God-given right to run this campaign, and no one else could be involved. If you take Vote Leave back to its roots, it was formed out of Business for Britain, and the original concept was this was a group that was going to be led by businessmen. Now it's led by politicians, mainly Conservative politicians, as I say, that are trying to marginalise other people in the Eurosceptic world, particularly UKIP and others. So you can understand that we are slightly aggrieved at the process.
Yes, although right at the heart of it is this allegation of a stitch-up by the Electoral Commission, and I think it's extremely important that you supply us with everything.
Well, I'm very happy to do so. The 2 points that lead to a stitch-up is announcing to the other side 2 days before the...
Well, you've made 2 points to us today.
Okay, so we're happy to substantiate
rather than us persist with this in any great detail now. As I said at the beginning, I don't think we want to have half a hearing on this point.
Well, you've asked the question. I mean, in the document, for instance, they quoted the support of Labour Leave, who had specifically written to the Electoral Commission saying that they were not involved with Vote Leave anymore because of their practices, and they didn't like them. So we've got a whole list of people that were quoted in the document that basically were not happy or willing to be involved.
Well, it's very helpful clarification, but in any case, we're going to get something in writing, and I think it's on the basis of that we may or may not decide to take this further in one way or another. I'd like to turn to a number of the statements you've been making about the cost of membership.
Yeah.
I'd like to turn first of all to the cost in terms of contributions to the EU budget, exchequer cost. I noticed that your website contains various figures for the amount that the UK would save. You have a figure for 12 billion and you have two very close figures of a little over 14 billion on your website. Which of those is the correct figure?
Which year?
Well, it's not marked on your website, which is why we're asking you.
Well, I think, for clarification, the 12 billion is an estimate of the current year. And if you go back to the previous year, it was 8.5 billion, then 9.8. So I hotly dispute the vote leave.
Yeah, well, come on to that in just a moment.
Okay.
But you've also provided a figure of 14 billion.
I'd have to see the individual thing. I'm not au fait with everything we put out.
It's on your website.
It may well be. I don't read every single line of the website.
I think it's important.
I'm not trying to obscure it. I'm just.
But I do think it's important that somebody in your organisation should be checking extremely carefully numbers as important as this.
We have a research
and making sure that they're correct, and making sure that they're sourced well enough. And as you've just pointed out, you yourself have been asking me questions that I might have asked you, which is which year do these numbers pertain to?
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm not going to deny that.
And I think in the interest of trying to get clarity in this campaign so we can all work off the same figures, it would be extremely helpful if your organisation document carefully in future all these numbers so that everybody can trace exactly what they're referring to.
We have a research department, and per se the number won't be wrong, but I do agree with you that the clarity over which year it pertains to is quite important. I mean, if you look at the kind of breakdown for 214, you start with a kind of gross number of 19 million.
No, we don't need to go through it in detail now, but I know the points you're going to make, which
I thought you were all about
it depends what you want to strip out. But again, I think it would be helpful if you, it's only in the interest of time, that you supply that in writing to us. And I note the undertaking you've given this afternoon that you're going to desist from putting figures out without having made sure that they're very accurately sourced, and also make sure that the existing figures on your website are correctly sourced. Mr. Tice, you wanted to add something?
Well, I did just... One of the challenges with the figures is that they do ebb and flow a bit, and indeed the ONS figures are different to the HM Treasury figures for the net contributions by a matter of over £1 billion in 2014. So it's a bit of a moving feast, and then how have they treated things like the extra money that we had to send over?
Merely using a consistent figure and sourcing it will already take you in some
absolutely
way
right. I accept that.
down the road of everyone knowing what we're talking about. You, Mr. Banks, a moment ago wanted to compare this to Vote Leave's estimate of 19. What did you want to say there?
Well, I think it's just disingenuous, and I think it helps neither side, both the in and out campaign, to have numbers that are...
Why is it disingenuous?
Well, I mean, in a sense, you have the 19 billion, but I mean, I'm just talking at the top of my head now. I think 4 to 5 billion never actually leaves the UK. So to quote a figure which is technically correct but isn't...
That's the point that we've made in earlier hearings.
Right.
It's the same. I think we can move on from that, but I think it's helpful clarification. Chris Phil.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to briefly continue on this point about the budget contributions, the figure of 14 billion, roughly speaking, which you're quoting, does that include or exclude payments made by the European Union back to UK businesses and, for example, farmers?
Well, I revert back to what I said. It depends on the year you're talking about, but no, that's the gross contribution.
So when you say there would be a saving of approximately 12 or 14 billion, you are assuming a saving to the Exchequer, the UK Treasury, you're assuming that all of those payments currently being made, for example, to farmers, just stop.
No.
Then how is it a saving?
It's up to the Treasury to decide how to deploy the funds it's now got, isn't it?
But for there to be a saving, that expenditure would have to just... For the 14 billion to be realised as a saving to the UK Exchequer, those payments, which add up to some approximately 4 to 5 billion, currently made, for example, to UK farmers, they would have to just cease, wouldn't they? Otherwise, the saving, if they continued, the saving wouldn't be 14 billion. Hang on, finish the question. If those payments continued, the saving wouldn't be circa 14 billion, it would be circa 8 billion.
That's correct.
So for your 14 billion to be accurate, you are having to assume that all of those payments currently made by the EU on science research grants, farm subsidies, would cease.
No, it's up to the Treasury to deploy the cash it has available into which areas it wants to deploy it, doesn't it?
You're saying they're not going to deploy it,
No,
you're saying they're going
well, implicitly you are.
not even explicitly. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah. No, I don't think that's right. I think you're putting words into our mouth. That's not what we're saying. The 14 billion figure, net of the rebate, that is the gross saving to the country, and then the government of the day can choose how to deploy it.
So that
is a perfectly legitimate
provided you
statement.
explain clearly in your rubric, that's what the figure means. I suppose that might be correct. Sorry.
Yeah. So is it your position that the government? Well, clearly, if your 14 billion figure to be correct, if that is a saving to the Exchequer, you must be assuming all of those payments cease. Otherwise, the figure is not 14 billion.
As I say, I repeat what I just said. You're putting words into our mouth.
I'm not. The 14 billion is your figure.
No, but it's then what you do with it. The 14 billion is then open to the government of the day to invest and spend as it sees fit. That is a completely different thing from what you just suggested.
Would you, as an elector, as a member of British society, would you wish to see the payments to, for example, farmers and the payments made to fund science work continue or discontinue?
And not only continue, but actually they could indeed increase, because we'd be able to make those payments more directly without the huge bureaucracy and unnecessary cost and waste that goes on in the European Union. So actually people could benefit by more rather than less.
Then were we to withdraw, and were those payments to continue as you're saying they should, the saving to the Exchequer would not be 14 billion, it would be 7, wouldn't it?
Well,
I mean, that's straightforward.
I think it's a slightly nonsensical argument. You could choose to reduce the foreign aid budget by 5 billion to pay the farmers if you wanted. It's a Treasury decision. To link the two is irrelevant. I mean, it's a saving. You decide what to do with it. You're the parliamentarians.
You're saying you would do with it as is currently being done with it.
Well, first of all, farming wasn't invented in 1975. It was there beforehand. And
the subsidies were
how
invented in
Parliament
1975.
chooses to subsidise certain industries. I mean, the steel industry is a good example. You've chosen not to subsidise it. You've chosen to subsidise farming. You've tried to subsidise different things. You work out your own priorities.
And let's be clear, we subsidised farming before 1975, and we will continue to subsidise farming after we leave the European Union. The great thing is, it's within our gift, it's within our choice, and we can spend the money wisely.
Well, I mean, that point is correct, but and I think we need to move on. But the fiscal saving, given what you've said, that you would continue the farm subsidies, the saving to the Exchequer would not be 14 billion, it would be 8 billion, albeit that we control that money.
I think the implication from what was said is that it's a saving of what we send to Brussels, that we can then determine and take control as to how we spend it ourselves. That's the point.
I think that is a distinction you might wish to draw more clearly when you mention figures like 14 billion.
By the way,
which is back to the point that I made in my initial exchanges with you. I'm grateful to you for your commitment that you are now going to sort this out on your website and all your literature. But if I may just, in parentheses, add, we did ask you to supply us with all your literature, and we haven't yet had it.
Well, that's an interesting point, actually, because I'm not aware of any request for any information, and I specifically asked if there was any information required and was told there wasn't.
Okay.
So,
well, we'll check that out at our end.
Great.
It was received by other campaigns. If it wasn't received by you, we'd be grateful if you could respond to it immediately.
But taking on your point, the membership fee is only one component part of what we might potentially save from leaving the European Union. So, for instance, the regulatory burden and various other items doesn't come into that. So I don't think you can just take one item and say, aha.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you have alighted on my very next topic.
Good.
You must possess some kind of psychic powers, or maybe somebody's somewhere there. Who knows? Who knows? Right, so you mentioned the regulatory costs of membership of the European Union, which was my next question. What would you estimate the regulatory cost to British business of membership of the EU to be?
I think it's unknown, but what I do know is if you attempt to harmonise all products and services across the EU, then legislate for that, it will be a very large number.
Well, it's not unknown according to your website.
Finish.
Hang on.
Am I going to finish?
Go on then.
Yeah, okay. So, for instance, we export to the United States of America. We have to follow their rules. We have to follow the guidelines they lay down. The same with Japan. So, with the European regulation, it is an added burden that is put on us because it affects all businesses, not just the businesses that export into Europe, which is not that many.
So to give you a figure, Open Europe, think tank that you probably all know, they estimate that the cost of the top, I think, 100 regulations is in the order of 33 billion a year. Mm-hmm. Now, clearly there's many more than 100, but I think their view was that was the largest 100.
Yes, indeed. So when Mr. Banks said a moment ago, nobody knows, the figure your website does purport to know. Your website quotes exactly the figure that Mr. Tice just mentioned. It quotes Open Europe's figure of 33 billion. So your website is a little bit less nuanced in its estimation.
Well, but let's be clear. That is the top 100 regulations, as I just said. There are clearly thousands of regulations that have an additional cost, but there's a tail.
Okay, so you're basing your public comments on the Open Europe estimate of 33 billion. It's what you quote on your website. It's what you quoted just now. Now, Open Europe themselves, so the source of your figure, produced a note very recently, by which I think I mean in the last few days, and they make clear that, in fact, they've gone through all of these regulations, these 100 regulations, and they say that although the current cost is estimated at 33 billion, they think many of these regulations, many of these costs would continue to apply even if we left. Are you aware what Open Europe are saying is the feasible annual saving?
I'm sure that's true, by the way.
Okay.
I'm not disputing that.
Okay.
That would be the case.
Yeah.
That's why I say the figure's unknown, but it is a number that is positive.
But again, the great thing is, it is within the gift of the government of the day to strip away unnecessary regulations from the businesses that do not need to suffer the burden.
I mean, this is probably the point, that harmonisation of everything across 500 million people, by its definition, needs an empire of bureaucrats and politicians to administer it. And I mean, the straight cucumber may be apocryphal, but it's right in the sense that you're trying to harmonise and produce a standardised approach to everything. So by definition, the regulations around that must be onerous.
So I understand the point about where decision-making lies, and I understand the point about bureaucracy, but that wasn't the question I asked. The question I asked was, what did Open Europe say was the feasible annual saving? I can't. I'm asking since you're quoting Open Europe, I'm asking if you know.
I don't know.
You don't. Okay. Well, it's 12.8. So Open Europe think that of the 33 billion cost, only 12.8 is a feasible saving, and they estimate that the maximum conceivable saving is 24 billion. So again, I would suggest that in your public pronouncements and your website, you amend or at the very least clarify that 33 billion, because Open Europe, the source of it themselves, say that figure will not be realised. And let me talk about one or two.
That's still a very big number, by the way.
Well, that depends on the benefit you think accrues from single market membership, which I'm sure we'll discuss later. In fact, the estimates of single market membership benefit are materially higher than the numbers we're discussing here. I mean, they're in the sort of 30, 40 billion level. But I think colleagues are going to come on to that later. To take an example illustrating why this 33 figure isn't realistic, you mentioned
Sorry, can I just interrupt? I mean,
yes.
You know, you said the Open Europe have just come up with something in the last few days. I mean, I don't know if you've got the date there, but clearly, we've made representations on the basis of the information that we had at the time, and any think tank could obviously change its figures at any point. I think that the real point is there are tens of billions of pounds, and that just represents the top 100 regulations. I don't think you should underestimate. There are tens of billions of pounds that can be saved every single year for the 95% of UK businesses that do not export to the EU and probably have no intention of exporting to the EU.
Well, now that I've drawn, I think so you're pleading ignorance, I think, on this.
No, I'm not pleading ignorance at all.
But now I've drawn your attention to it.
I am actually pleading ignorance because I haven't read the report. So yes, I am.
Okay, we've got someone not pleading ignorance. Someone have. Well, when you've sorted out that divergence of view, you can perhaps amend your website.
I started off by saying the cost of regulation was unknown.
You did.
I didn't say that.
But that's not what your website says. Your website says 33 billion, and now I've pointed out what Open Europe are now saying. Perhaps you can
for the top 100 regulations.
Yeah. So to take some examples, for instance, one of the regulations which has a cost is the EU's Capital Requirements Directive, which is counted as a cost in the 33 billion. But for example, the UK government has voluntarily chosen to impose higher capital requirements on banks than is required under EU regulation. So withdrawing from the European Union would make, unless the UK government took a different view in the future, would make, again, no difference to the burden of capital requirement regulations on UK banks, would it? Because we're already choosing to go further than Europe require us to.
You're saying that's the cost of regulation?
Well, I'm saying it wouldn't be a saving. If we left, then there would not be a saving.
It's not a saving. I mean, the bank's capital is not either a saving nor an addition.
Well, it's counted as a cost in the Open Europe.
Someone that owns a bank, I would hardly dispute that. I mean, that's extra capital you have to put into bank. It's not the cost of business.
Well, it's counted as a cost of business in Open Europe's calculation.
It's scored as a cost of business in standard bank accounts.
Well, I'd say it's wrong.
But again, the real point is...
That's something you might want to take up with the Bank of England and probably the Basel Committee.
I've got a whole sheet on the Bank of England when you get to it.
But to come back
number of other people.
The point is it is back within our control to decide what the level should be.
In order, this is rather similar to the previous point.
The amount of capital the bank holds is not a cost of doing business. It really isn't.
Well, it's a cost in the sense it means they've got to put... Well, it's a cost according to Open Europe, and you're quoting their figures, so you should take it up with Open Europe as well. And it makes the bank less efficient in terms of a return on equity analysis. But anyway, Open Europe says... I'm going to move on. Open Europe says it's a cost, and they're the people you're quoting, so take it up with them. To take another example, when it comes to environmental and climate change regulation, which is the biggest single item in Open Europe's 33 billion total... Again, the UK government, rightly or wrongly, some might say wrongly, has chosen to go beyond what Europe require in it, and we've signed up to this Paris Agreement, which is not a EU agreement; it's a multinational global agreement. So, were we to leave the European Union, we are still bound by this Paris Accord. So again, there wouldn't be any environmental saving because we're still signed up to standards that are higher than Europe's.
I think you actually put your finger on a very interesting point. That a lot of the regulation that's coming now is on a world basis, not on a European basis. So in fact, the European Union is a wholly unnecessary middleman in the whole process, because what you're talking about there is that regulations for banking are made pretty much on a kind of international, global basis, and implemented by the European Union or the Bank of England. So in fact, the European Union is just a middleman in the implementation of what is a lot of global rules.
So that is, if that view is correct, and I think it is to a large extent correct, then withdrawing from the Europe, looking simply at the money rather than the decision-making process and who decides. So laying to one side the sovereignty question, simply in terms of the cost of these regulations, pulling out of the EU would not deliver these amazing cost savings because we'd be signed up to these regulations anyway.
But you're talking about very high-level things, banking, climate change and the like.
So I'm not talking about them, you are. It's your figure, it's on your website.
You're talking to me about them, okay. But what I'm saying is that these are very high-level things that are kind of discussed at an international basis. But we're talking about regulation that's imposed on small and medium-sized businesses from Europe. And does nothing to do with any of the stuff you've just mentioned. It really hasn't. And the cost of regulation, as I say, is an unknown quantity. What I do know is it's a positive benefit not to have 100% of these EU regulations imposed on everybody.
That's the key.
It's pretty much the nuts of it.
Okay. Well, I think what we've established is that the 33 billion figure that you've quoted on your website has been disowned by its own author, Open Europe, and I look forward to you clarifying that on your website. Now I've drawn it to your attention. And secondly, a lot of these savings would not be realised because we're signed up to the regulation anyway. So I think I've made that point. You've made a separate point about sovereignty and who takes decisions, which no doubt will get explored later. But I think I've established the point I wanted to, Chairman. So
can I just clarify on that? The 33 billion was a cost, right?
Yeah.
what you've referred to as their recent report, which I accept I have not seen, I think you refer to what actually could be saved. There is clearly a difference between a cost and a saving.
Well, so
we're absolutely clear on that we're comparing apples with apples.
Yeah, well, you're implying that the 33 billion. You're implying on your website that the 33 billion pound cost would be saved in its entirety. They're saying only part. If we left, they're saying only part of that would be saved.
Okay, well, we're very happy, of course, to check the implication. If the implication is wrong, that's one thing. If we've referred to it as a cost, that's another thing. So we'll check that out.
Just to clarify, you're not alone in using this figure. Boris Johnson has used this figure. And
we're in good company then.
And Vote Leave have been using this figure. And it's in response to cross-examination of those that Open Europe have felt the need to clarify what they've been doing and those hearings. You did make another point, though, Mr. Banks, which I think is significant and may have substance but requires work to substantiate, which is whatever the view may be about these big mega regulations, the top 100, the fact is that the small man out there is being hit by hundreds of little regulations, and those all add up and they carry a cost. And it seems to me that if your campaign wants to have maximum impact, it might consider trying to work out and substantiate a figure in that area, because in order to try and fill the gap between the 13 and the 33 that appears to have opened up in Open Europe's work since we started examining it carefully, you feel it should be filled by that calculation. Is that something that you might consider?
I think, as someone said, it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. And I think if Open Europe can't calculate the numbers they spend all day long doing it,
it's not easy for them. And to be fair to Open Europe, as I pointed out last time, if you look carefully enough, even in their original use of these figures, though perhaps it's not as prominent as it might have been, the qualifications are there to be read and to be found.
The much maligned Norway only implements, for the last 15 years, 8% of EU regulations. So clearly they presumably implement stuff that's high level and big and choose to discard stuff they don't like.
And furthermore, the suggestion which a number of people have made, including Mr. Johnson, that Open Europe was saying 95% of these benefits to regulation, offsetting this gross cost figure, and everyone's agreed it was a gross cost figure, 33 billion, may not materialise. In fact, that, as Open Europe have clarified, and indeed did clarify in their original document, if you look carefully enough, was a reference only to the energy and climate change package of regulation, as a substantial but nonetheless relatively small part of the total figure. Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Banks and Mr. Tice, for coming to our committee this afternoon. The Treasury have estimated that the economic impact of leaving the EU would be £4,300 per household. Mr. Banks, I think you said that this was a bargain basement price. Do you think that £4,300 is a price worth paying?
Well, what I said was that if it was correct, even if it was correct, it would be a price worth paying to get back our own democracy. So in that sense, that's correct. But I said if it's correct, if you actually look at what the Treasury report produced, it estimated over 5 years that growth would decline from, or would be, instead of 37%, it would be 29%. Now, any Treasury forecast fails almost at the first hurdle because you just can't forecast these kind of things. It's almost impossible. They then quote the GDP as the household income, further, kind of complicating the numbers and just the whole spin of it.
What I'm interested in getting at, though, Mr. Banks, is if it is a correct figure, you do think that would be a price worth paying for leaving the European Union?
My view of life,
if we would take that as given, you think that would be a price worth paying for leaving the European Union?
The number quoted is the most optimistic Treasury forecast I've ever seen, ever. Every assumption is
Mr.
incorrect.
Banks,
I opened up by saying yes.
So yes, you think that is a price
more clear than that.
worth paying.
This isn't
that
about
is,
pounds and pence. It's about our democracy.
well, let's go into what it is in terms of pounds and pence. I think it's 21 pence an hour, which is about £5 a day, £150 a month. I think many of our constituents would regard £150 a month as quite a substantial amount of money that they couldn't afford to be without. But you would say to those people that £150 a month is a price worth paying for leaving the European Union.
This is a 15-year estimate that clearly is wrong before it even starts.
But Mr. Banks, you say,
I would say
even
that,
if this was correct, sorry,
well,
Mr. Banks, even if this is correct, you believe, and it's a perfectly valid view, you believe that £150 a month is a price worth paying for leaving the European Union.
I would say the figure is massively incorrect.
But you would say that was a price worth paying? Yes.
I believe it's massively incorrect, but if it was to be the case, I would still advocate leaving.
Thank you.
That's clearer than that.
That is very clear. Thank you very much, Mr. Banks. So the case for Brexit for you is more about an ideological principle rather than an economic cost-benefit analysis.
It's both. It's both. I mean, if you look at the formation of the economic crisis in Europe, it's broadly been brought about because the euro was introduced as a political experiment rather than an economic experiment. Germany has a currency rate that is 35% too cheap for its economy. The south and the east have got a roughly 35% too expensive, and the thing is ripping itself to pieces.
I would agree with you on that, Mr. Banks. And so, keeping us out of the euro was one of the best decisions of the last Labour government. But we're not in the euro. This referendum is not on the euro. It's on our membership of the EU.
If I can finish what I was going to say. So you have an economic situation that can only be resolved one way, and that must be by total integration of the remaining countries. And it must be with a massive transfer of surplus from north to south and east. That's the only way it can be resolved. So this concept that we can kind of sit on the edge of it and avoid the worst of it is wrong. When the crisis comes, it will invariably suck us in. We paid for the Irish crisis, we paid for the Greek crisis, we will invariably be drawn into this. So my supposition is that economically it's a disaster. And I would pay almost any price to be on the, away from it.
Well, I mean, one could argue that even if we weren't in the EU, we would be affected by a crisis on our doorstep. Yes. But also, it is the case that the Prime Minister has got us an opt-out of paying for crises relating to the euro, the single currency. I'll just go back to my point though, because my question really was, even if there is an economic cost for you, Mr. Banks, it is the ideological principle, which again is totally valid. But I'm just trying to get at where you're coming from on this. That is more important than the cost-benefit analysis.
I mean, the basic bottom line is, even if you took the worst-case scenario, which is World Trade Organisations and pay the tariff, that's 2/3 of our membership fee. The fact of the matter is that this assessment is based on a load of falsehoods. It assumes that there's full single market in financial services. The EU trade deal we do is no better than Canada, and there's no productivity gains from any of the regulations. Well, I mean, if you had to put together a work of fiction, the Treasury report is that.
Well, then let's look beyond the Treasury report. The IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the London School of Economics, Oxford Economics, all of the economists and the major investment banks have all given opinions indicating that Brexit could be economically damaging. Why would all of them be making the same argument, Mr. Banks?
As a bank that had no mortgage debt on its books in 2008, every single one of those institutions missed what was spectacularly the biggest financial bubble the world has ever seen. I think they're just wrong. I mean, the Treasury recommended the RM, the PEG, they destroy more British industry than the Luftwaffe.
The Treasury also recommended that we don't go into the euro, something that you would have agreed with, Mr. Banks.
In 2003, the Treasury suggested that if we join the euro, it'd increase our exports trade by 50%. The Treasury's track record is not good, nor is the IMF's. The IMF suggested we should join the euro. The IMF also criticised George Osborne and his austerity package, saying that it would lead to massive unemployment 4 years ago. They have a woeful track record. They are led by a massively Europhile person. And, thank heavens George Osborne didn't listen to them 4 or 5 years ago. But you can't pick and choose. The reality is, you talk about economists, probably 4 of our best city economists, so Roger Bootle, Ruth Lee, Tim Congdon, and the Mayor of London's economist Gerard Lyons, all have written papers and recommend Brexit. And they are, I think, some of the most highly respected economists in the City of London.
Well, let's look at the most respected economists and institutions. The Bank of England governor has said that Brexit, he said this at our committee, was the biggest domestic risk to financial stability. Vote Leave thought that this was scaremongering. Do you think that the Bank of England governor is scaremongering?
I was on Newsnight that night after he spoke, and I made it very clear he was referring to a domestic risk. He also referred in the same hearing to the global risks, which were much bigger, of what's going on in China, what's going on with the commodities crisis, and by implication, what's going on in America. Businesses have uncertainty and risks every day of the working week. This is just another uncertainty that will be there for a period until we negotiate a new trade agreement. But he made it very clear, it's a domestic risk.
Yes, it's a domestic risk. It's
but he also said...
Sorry, Mr. Tice.
Well,
he said it was the biggest...
You shouldn't have general elections, because in general election, people start getting worried about what's going to happen in the general election. There's always risk, there's always uncertainty. This political or politicians' ideas that you live in this kind of risk-free world that doesn't have risk attaining to it, we control nothing.
Yes, and that's general elections, Mr. Banks. It's up to the electorate to decide, and at this referendum, it's up to the voters to decide whether we stay in the EU or leave the EU. But when they're making that decision, they need to know what the risks are. And the Bank of England governor said not that the referendum was the biggest domestic risk, but that Brexit was the biggest domestic risk to our financial stability. It's not an argument against referenda or against elections, but is about telling people what the risks and implications of their decisions are.
But in general terms, establishment, politicians, civil service don't like change. So by definition, any change is a risk and is uncertainty.
But I do think it's important to have the overall context, which is in the same hearing he referred to the global risks. I don't think it's right to just cherry-pick and infer that that's all he was alluding to.
I wasn't, Mr. Tice, cherry-picking. I recognise that there are many risks to financial stability, both global and domestic. But I would argue that at a time when our economic recovery is still fragile, and you would have seen the GDP numbers today showing that GDP growth has fallen, that construction, investment and agricultural output have all fallen, it would be a dangerous time to take on more risks. And the Bank of England governor, and you've spoken about other economists' views, but I would argue, and I think most people would see the Bank of England governor as the most respected economist. He thinks it's the biggest domestic risk to financial stability. You don't
by the way,
share that view.
I don't even believe it's the biggest domestic risk to stability. The Bank of England has printed £500 billion of quantitative easing. It's bought back bonds, its own bonds. It's collapsed interest rates to zero for 8 years and created asset bubbles all over the place, from property to stock market to the like. The biggest domestic risk this country faces is deflation of those asset bubbles.
What do you think the implications of leaving the EU would be on interest rates, Mr. Banks?
In what sense?
Well, what do you think will happen to interest rates, Mr. Banks?
Interest rates in America are zero. Interest rates in Switzerland are negative. Interest rates in Japan are zero. And interest rates in the UK will remain zero because everything's buggered. And that's why it's all at zero. Well, so you can say that interest rates go up, but
I didn't say.
I'm saying it won't.
Mr. Banks, I didn't say anything about what would happen to interest rates. I was asking Mr. Banks. The way these committees work is we ask questions and you answer them. Well, you haven't listened to the question. My question was, What do you think, Mr Banks, will happen to interest rates in the event that we leave the European Union?
I was attempting to answer that. The interest rates worldwide are either zero or negative, and they will remain at zero or negative in this country, whether we Brexit, exit or Lexit or do anything else.
So you don't think there'll be any implications?
Absolutely not.
I don't think there'll be any implication at all. Interest rates are not set by whether or not we are a member of a political union, and for people on the Remain camp, such as the Prime Minister, to suggest that mortgage rates would rise is complete and utter nonsense. Interest rates are set by totally different economic factors.
By the way, interest rates should rise. Do you think it's normal to have 0% interest rates? It's telling you something, isn't it, really?
So you think that interest rates should rise? If you were the Bank of England or the Monetary Policy Committee, you'd put up interest rates?
You're putting words into my mouth. What
you just said they should rise, Mr. Banks.
I said, in a normal course of events, it's not normal to have 0% interest rates. It's telling you that something's very wrong, isn't it?
Yes. Interest rates are 0.5%. That's the.
They've got negative interest rates in Switzerland and Japan.
I'm not asking about interest rates in those countries. What do you think will happen to sterling, Mr. Banks, on the event of us leaving the European Union?
Sterling's a very good question, because you talk about sort of tariffs on world trade and stuff like that. The actual, in the last 3 months, the pound-euro rate has dropped 10%. That's worth double the tariffs into World Trade Organization rules into Europe. So effectively, a fall in sterling is not a bad thing at all. We're running a massive trade deficit. We're running a current account balance deficit. In fact, our currency deserves to be a hell of a lot lower than where it currently stands.
So do you think then, Mr. Banks, if we leave the EU, sterling will fall?
I don't think it matters whether it's not Brexit related. Sterling goes up or down, and currencies go up or down, depending on how the markets feel about the underlying factors of the economy. It's nothing to do with Brexit whatsoever.
But it would have an impact, wouldn't it? Because the value of a currency depends on people's investors' propensity to invest in gilts, in equities, etc. In the country. So I'm just asking, what do you think will happen to sterling in the event of Brexit?
If you want my opinion, I would say it would drop, then it would recover. That's the way of markets. I mean, the last 3 months, the pound has dropped nearly 10% against the euro. In the last week or so, it's recovered 3 or 4% up.
Mm-hmm. So you think then, this is very interesting, it's an important issue as well. So you think the immediate impact of us leaving the European Union would be sterling falling against, presumably, the euro and against the dollar?
Well, look, in a world where economic orthodoxy has been suspended for the duration until it all hits us in the face, which is unfortunately where we've been for the last 40 years or last 20 years, at lower currency rate, everyone in the world is trying to reduce their currency rate, and they're doing it by quantitative easing. So the Japanese are printing money to try and reduce the value of the yen. The dollars, they're printing money to reduce the value of the dollar. The Bank of England's printing money to reduce the value of the pound. They're all trying to reduce their currency rate to become more competitive. So in the event that it did drop 10%, it would matter not, and in fact it would probably boost our export position.
Well, two things. First of all, the main reason for quantitative easing and low interest rates is to try and stimulate domestic demand through both investment and consumption. But the implications of sterling falling would be that the price of imports would go up.
Yep.
And of course, we are a net importer, so that would have a positive effect on inflation. So you would expect, at least in the short run, for the costs of goods and services to go up in the event of us leaving the European Union.
Everyone worldwide is trying to fight deflation at the moment. Is the enemy rather.
So you agree that at least the short-run impact would be higher prices?
No.
Sorry, Mr. Tice, I was asking Mr. Banks.
I don't want to dominate it.
No, I'm asking you the question, Mr. Banks.
The point is that you have to have a balance between exports and imports. If you're saying, would prices domestically go up because the pound drops? Yes. Is that a bad thing? No.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Can I just add to that?
I'm
If you have something you
fine
particularly
with
want
you.
to add.
Well, I think let's be very clear. If sterling drops due to short-term currency speculators by a few hundred traders in the city for a few weeks, that is not going to have an inflationary impact. The biggest risk that most developed economies around the world have is deflation, not inflation. So I think that's very important. And the reality is currency on a medium and long-term basis, currency rates are set by all sorts of things, and how well an economy is doing and the perception of the ability to repay debt. So it's wrong to just draw the analogy and say Brexit would be hugely damaging for sterling.
Well, I mean, I was having a conversation with Mr. Banks, and most people believe that sterling would fall. Mr. Banks seemed to agree with that, and of course that pushes up the price of imports, which pushes up domestic inflation. That may be a good or a bad thing, but it's just important that we have the facts.
It makes the exports more competitive, and it depends how long it falls for, and whether it falls in the next week as a function of purely speculation.
All those things are true, but it is important that people understand what the impact of Brexit would be, and I think that's been a useful discussion. Thank you, Chairman.
Helen Goodman.
Thank you. Mr. Banks, I want to bring you back to this issue of the bargain basement price for leaving the European Union. I'm not sure whether you're aware of the median household income in this country.
45,000?
No, as a matter of fact, it's 25,630.
Not according to the Treasury's report.
And the median weekly earnings are 27,456. So if people had to pay 4,300 for leaving the EU, their incomes would fall from 25,500 to £21,330 a year. Do you think those people would feel it was a bargain basement price?
Well, the figures that the Treasury have quoted are over 15 years, and they quote the 45,000 as the household income when you get to the end of the 15 years. So whether that's the difference between what it is now and what you get to, and that's the cost over 15 years. So you're talking about apples and pears here a little bit.
I think these are in 2015 prices. If you look at the Treasury document...
No, but the 4,500 is calculated over the period of...
4,500 expressed in terms of 2015 GDP in 2015 prices is what they're saying. So it's...
Yes, but it's in 2030.
Yeah. I know it's in 2020 or 2030, but the prices are on the basis of this year's prices. So it's not that we've got masses and masses of inflation. By 2030, that number of 4,300 will be much
okay, so
higher.
What they've done in the report, as I understand it, is they forecast the growth will be, instead of 37%, 29%, based on a whole series of factors which I think are erroneous. So I start from the position the report is just a bunch of rubbish, which it is basically. I mean, you can't forecast over 15 years. In a business, you're lucky if you can forecast over 6 months and a year at the outset, and beyond that, it's just a complete wild guess. So the numbers you're quoting, I just think are fanciful.
Well, I could contest what you're saying about long-term forecasting, which in fact I think is easier than short-term forecasting, but we won't go there. I'm just trying to get you to focus on the fact that a drop of £4,300 for the average household would be some 17%. And to ask you, really, when you reflect on this carefully, do you really think that most people would regard a drop in their annual income of that sort of quantity as being a bargain?
I certainly regard our parliamentary democracy and the right to make our own rules as paramount above anything else. And I don't think people, when they're hitting the beaches of Normandy, were saying, well, this is going to cost us £2,000. They were fighting for democracy. Now, I know it's an extreme example, but that's the way I feel about the European Union.
Okay,
but
well,
I have to say, though, to forecast something over 15 years, and to come up with a 37% growth rate or a 29% growth rate is just statistical nonsense.
Well, the truth of the matter is they gave a range depending on which
Did you see the
scenario one
equation?
went to. And the range was from 2,600 to 5,200,
Yep.
with 4,300 depending on what the negotiation was. But you think that it doesn't really make sense to do these sort of calculations. So could I ask you why you've included similar calculations on your website? You've got two numbers. For the financial impact on households.
Yeah.
You say staying in the European Union would cost the UK £9,625 per household in one place, and in another place you say you would be better off to the tune of £933. So you do in fact think these sort of calculations are meaningful, and you have put some numbers on your website.
I'll answer one part of that question. The £930 is a calculation based on cheaper food prices and a range of costs that are incurred under the EU. So I don't think that's a forecast in the sense of 15 years out. If there is a forecast there that is a long-range forecast of more than a couple of years, I would agree with you. So if that is on there, we point us to where it is. And
could you tell me why you've got two such wildly divergent numbers on your website, 9,625 and 933? Which number are you banking on? Which number are you confident on?
I have to see the...
Well, these are your numbers. They're not my numbers. They're your numbers.
Can I just say, first of all, we produce probably enough material to cut down a small rainforest. I'm not familiar with every single last bit of it. The £933 I am, that's based on lower food costs and things like that. In fact, Patrick Minford from Cardiff University calculates it's upwards of £2,000. So there's lots of varying figures, but any long-range forecast is inappropriate.
Well,
so if there is one on there, I would take it down, but I'm not familiar with it.
I think it is very clear, just to reinforce what's just been said, the £933 number, that is an annual forecast. So it is much easier, clearly, to forecast for an annual saving. And there's a key difference between a 15-year forecast that you were previously alluding to.
I think the 933 number is consistent with the 33 billion which you were discussing with Bristol. It's different. So
the 933
so what's the 933 based on?
That's based on data that came from the Change or Go report by Business for Britain in the middle of last year.
And so that's not the costs of regulation.
No, that's the overall saving. So it's not the cost of regulation. It includes all sorts of things.
So what does it include?
Well, I haven't got it in front of me, but it was after it's a 1,000-page report which looked at in very detail at all sorts of aspects, and that was its considered number, and that I believe is the number that Vote Leave also used because it was sourced from Business for Britain, their predecessor.
So you're saying that number includes the costs of regulation, the contribution to the EU budget, and the impact on the British economy.
Well, it's to do with food costs.
Yeah.
Or it's just to do with food costs?
No,
I'd have to refer back to it.
It's a long list of items.
I mean, if it's just to do with food costs,
it's not.
That would suggest it was about the CAP and agricultural tariffs.
I didn't say it's just to do with food costs. I said it's part of it, but I'm not. I would have to go back and actually look at that.
It's a long list of items, but for example, on the food costs, it's the lower food costs because you don't have tariffs on non-EU food products, for example. But it is a long list of items, very carefully considered, and I think it's
very carefully considered. But you actually can't tell us what it is.
Well, I haven't got it in front of me. I mean, I've been through it previously, but
okay.
We're not walking encyclopedias that carry huge amounts of information in our heads.
That's everything.
I try my best.
That's everything.
I can tell you. I can reiterate, just for the record, I have been through it, and I thought it was a very good working document.
Good. Well, I'm glad
certainly does have
I'm
a
glad
report.
when you read it, you felt that, but it's not very enlightening for us on the committee or for the general public.
Well, it's a
You can't
1,000-page document.
explain
It's a
it.
1,000-page document that's on the Vote Leave website. You've obviously had a copy of it. I think anybody can read it and review it, and they can either agree or disagree with my perception of it.
My understanding is that the 9,000 number comes from an analysis by Patrick Minford, of whom you were speaking earlier, and that number works on the assumption that you're going to repeal all EU legislation on social matters, employment matters, and the environment. Do you think that's realistic?
I haven't seen the report, and I'm afraid you've got us on this one. I can go away and give you a written answer, but I haven't seen Patrick Minford's report, and I don't think the 933 is based on his report.
No, but the 9625 is, and you've got that number on your website.
Well, we have a
as
research department that employs about 6 different people that is going through all of this stuff. I think they're pretty accurate, but if you've got a specific number that needs to be justified, I cannot justify it right now. I don't have the...
Well, what I'm trying to...
The point that I made at the beginning again, really,
Yeah.
we shouldn't need to be having these exchanges. I'm sorry, Helen, but we shouldn't need to be having this information, the core information, to enable us fully to understand where these numbers are derived from, how they're put together.
But Mr. Chairman, they're often a matter of opinion.
Should be available on your website if you have qualifications,
Yeah.
because you have personal opinions about them as well. Of course, those are also things that could be added. But what we have out there from your organisation are a range of numbers which is very difficult for us to understand, and therefore are virtually meaningless in the hands of the public. It's after all the public who are complaining noisily a lot that they are not able to get high quality information from either side of this campaign, and that they're having to rely on numbers which seem to flake a little when they're looked at carefully, and that appears to be what's happening with the numbers that we're addressing that we've found from your website.
I think it's a valid point, but when you have a situation where you've got a Treasury report that's saying it's a downside of 4,500...
We're going to cross-examine the Chancellor
but I'm just saying
his
you
report.
have,
I'd really rather concentrate on the numbers that's on your website. Helen Goodman.
My understanding is that Professor Minford is saying that all social and employment legislation should be repealed. So are you saying that in your vision of how life would be better after Brexit without the pressures for legislation in the social chapter imposed by the EU, you would want to have no holiday pay, no maternity pay, no constructive dismissal rules, no discrimination rules? Are you saying that you would like to see all those swept away?
No, not at all.
So in fact you wouldn't get those savings?
But I don't know. You're quizzing me on the report I haven't read. I can't answer your question. But on the
so which
question
social and
of,
employment legislation would you like to maintain?
I don't think I would want to remove any of it, but that's a matter for Parliament. I mean, the beauty of this is the powers return to your good selves, and you decide what you're going to do.
But Mr Banks, don't you seem understand? You have claimed that these savings would be achieved. They would only be achieved if certain pieces of legislation were repealed.
I haven't read the report.
I am telling you what you have told the public. Those savings would only be achieved if that legislation was repealed. Once I point out to you what legislation would need to be repealed, you seem to be running away from the statements which you were quite confident of when you walked into this room.
I'm not running away from anything. I haven't read Patrick Minford's report, therefore I don't know whether your characterisation of it is correct or not. You seem to be saying that.
It would be very helpful if two things occur. One is you write to us, is that, and two, that you make sure that your website fully clarifies what these numbers pertain to, so that the public themselves and others who want to check them.
But just going back on the social protection and the rest, it's up for you to elect a Labour government and to put in place what you want.
Just for the sake of... Sorry.
Okay, Helen, you've got the floor, unless you've got something important to say.
I think our website does source all this information out, and we do accept, everybody accepts, it's hard for the public to identify numbers, but our website is very clearly sourced so that people can then click through and read the report for themselves.
Okay, I'll ask you some questions that don't involve exact numbers then. I'll ask you about foreign direct investment. Now, the Bank of England, which my colleague Rachel Reeves was talking to you about before, fear that volatility and uncertainty will mean that we will see a reduction in foreign direct investment into this country. And indeed, this is borne out by statements from major industrialists like Nissan and Hitachi. And I'd like to ask you, first Mr. Tice and then Mr. Banks, whether you don't have some concerns about the loss of this foreign direct investment and the impact on jobs in this country.
I have no concerns about that at all. Initially, I'm going to take you to a 2013 report, I believe by Ernst & Young, of over 2,000 multinational businesses that asked specifically whether they thought Brexit would make the UK more or less attractive for multinational businesses. And for US and Asian firms, both of those geographies said that over 60% of those firms said it would make the UK a more attractive place. And I think the proof is in the pudding, isn't it? If you look at what's been announced just recently in the last few months, in the knowledge that the opinion polls are very close on Brexit, you've had HSBC decide after a 2 or 3 year review that they're going to retain their global headquarters in London. They could easily have deferred that decision if they thought it was going to be a major problem until after the 23rd of June. They didn't, because London has so many other major attractions to offer. Let's take Boeing, big US corporation, Boeing. Okay, they've just recently announced in the last couple of months that they're going to locate their European headquarters in London. Let's take Avon Cosmetics, a US corporation, just announced they're going to move their US headquarters to London. The Pentagon no less, under the auspices of the President of the United States, have recently announced a £200 million investment in Oxfordshire. All of these are fantastic news, and it is because of the attractiveness of the UK economy and our workforce and our transparency and our legal system and language. They have nothing to do with Brexit. So I think the proof is in the pudding of what corporations are doing, and no, they are not withholding long-term investment decisions. And let's take the car businesses. There are a number of car businesses over the last 12 months who have confirmed that actually Brexit would make no difference to their UK investment plans or their UK jobs.
That's not true, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, it is. It is.
I'm sorry, it is not what they have said. They have made it absolutely clear that this is central.
I'm sorry, we
to
fundamentally disagree. Last year, the head of UK Vauxhall said it would make no difference to their plans.
So you think that the fact that BMW have written to their employees advising them that it's in the interests of that firm to stay in the European Union can be ignored?
And BMW comes from which country?
Germany.
Germany. Of course they're going to say that.
What does that prove?
Yeah.
Well, it's in their interest. Germany wants us to stay in the European Union because we're the only two major net contributors. It is not true. It is not true to say that all of the car industry leaders have said that it would damage their UK investment plans, because they haven't said that. And indeed, last year, a number of them said the opposite. So we can go back and check the statements.
So your basic view is you're not worried about this. You think that lots of people are still investing, and when I say to you, well, Nissan doesn't take that view, or Hitachi doesn't take that view, or BMW doesn't take that view, you say, well,
maybe I've given you,
you just shrug that off.
I've given you some very specific examples of investment in the last couple of months that have been announced.
I would just, I mean, you yourself mentioned the President of the United States, and he did have something to say on this, and he was pretty negative about leaving Europe, I think you would agree, last week.
And for very clear reasons. Look, it may suit the United States, but what suits the United States doesn't necessarily suit the United Kingdom. And it's interesting, isn't it? He's not going to be in power for much longer, but I believe, well, certainly in the last 24 hours, for example, Ted Cruz has said we would be at the front of the line, not at the back of the queue.
Mr. Banks, do you have anything to say about foreign direct investment?
The only thing I have to say on Obama is I took my son to his piano lesson on Monday night, and the piano teacher said to me, "You're something to do with Brexit, aren't you?" I don't like that Mr. Obama coming over and telling us what to do. I think I've switched from unchanged to...
Mr. Banks, I'm not asking you about your child's piano lessons. I'm asking you about your views on foreign direct investment.
Well, a little bit of levity, surely. It's not do or die, surely. But
we haven't got that long, so
the bottom line is that when we didn't participate in the euro, we were warned that all the banks would leave London, hedge funds would go, it would be a wasteland. London is the number one preeminent capital in the world, and there's more hedge funds and banks you can shake a stick at. They look for the fact that it's English-based, it's got a legal structure, it's all sorts of different things, and it doesn't mean that because you're not part of the European Union, you're not going to get direct investment.
Well,
I do not believe that to be the case.
You brought me to the exact point that I was hoping you would come to, which is that you do seem to have a lot of financial experience. You've served as CEO of Manx Financial Group. You're currently Chief Executive of Southern Rock Insurance. Mr. Tice has been Director of Valley National Banking Corporation.
No, sorry. Never heard of it.
Well, it's in the CV which you've submitted to the committee.
What do you call it? Valley National?
The CV which you have given to us says that you are Chief Executive at Quidnet Capital Partners. Correct. Is that correct? You've been a partner of Tice Farms. Is that correct?
It's not a CV that I've submitted to you. It's from Bloomberg. Well, if it's from Bloomberg, then let's be very clear. It may or may not be accurate, and that is not accurate.
So you haven't been Director of CLS Holdings?
I have been Chief Executive of CLS Holdings. I don't know what you've got in front of you. It's not from me. It's not from our organisation. There's no such entity called Tice Farms. I've never heard of the banking corporation that you referred to. Very happy to give you my CV. It's on our website. I was Chief Executive of a multinational listed property company for 4 years between 2010 and 2014, which included operations in France, Germany and Sweden, as well as the United Kingdom. It's now a FTSE 250 business. So yes, it was a £1 billion business, very successful, and I took it from a share price of £4.70 to almost £14, tripling it in 4 years. So, I'm quite proud of that track record.
Well, that's very impressive.
Can I just add one point, which just on foreign direct investment, which really is important actually. The largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, Norwegian one, recently, in the last few weeks, confirmed that even if we voted for Brexit, they would continue their investments in the UK, if not increase them. That is another example from the ones I just previously gave you. I think it's just complete scaremongering to suggest that FDI is going to cease or reduce post a Brexit vote.
Well, you're both very successful. You've been very successful financially. So I just wonder why Mr. Banks said that his campaign would be won against the establishment of international bankers, multinational corporations, tax dodgers, and so on and so on and so on.
Well, I started my business with a desk and 2 telephones. So I built my business from scratch. I'm not going to apologise for owning diamond mines in South Africa, banks in the Isle of Man, and various other financial businesses. It's my, strong held opinion that it's the establishment that wants to stay in the European Union, and large corporations that like the European Union.
So your definition of the establishment is not what you said, international bankers, multinational corporate tax dodgers. Your definition is anybody who wants to stay in the EU.
No, not at all. That's misrepresenting me. I mean, the EU is a construct for big business. I mean, you talk about the social chapter legislation and the rest of it. The real reason for the European Union is for large multi-corporations not to pay their taxes.
Well,
which is pretty much the reason it's there. To have heavy regulation so that large business can compete on an unlevel playing field with small business.
Well,
that's the sole reason for
it sounds quite establishment to me when you think that the average income in this country is twice what it actually is. Don't
I was
you think?
quoting from the Treasury report where it would be in 15 years' time, which was the
Okay.
question you were asking.
All right. Okay.
Sorry.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in. And what I think alone on this committee view as your noble patriotic service, backed up with your money being where your mouth is. And I think many Eurosceptics in the country at large are extremely grateful for that it's been one of the things that has ensured that we can take on the establishment, which seems to spend taxpayers' money fighting its own particular corner. I've got a couple of sort of follow-up questions. I just wondered if you'd noticed, because Ms. Banks, you said you had some notes on the Bank of England, that when two members of the FPC came before this committee for their reappointment, they were asked what they thought the major risks to the UK economy was. Neither of them thought it worthwhile putting in Brexit. When questioned, one said that she'd forgotten and therefore, had she thought more carefully about it, she might have put it in. And the other said, well, actually, he thought it might be a brief short-term risk, but didn't think it seriously. So I wonder if you might like to refer to any of your other notes on the Bank of England and how you feel they're helping this debate.
I think I sort of covered that. The biggest domestic financial risk, I think, is quantitative easing. And not just the Bank of England, but worldwide. The inflation of asset bubbles everywhere, particularly property, particularly shares and other things. This is the biggest domestic risk we face. I mean, we talk about the fact that with open door immigration, it compresses wages for normal people. Over the last 7 years, the Sunday Times rich list has doubled. And the reason for that is that the free money at 0% interest rate is not getting through, as someone over there said, to the consumer to spend more money. It's going directly into asset bubbles. And these asset bubbles will spectacularly unravel. And so Brexit or otherwise is probably a mere sideshow to what's coming down the track.
And so do you agree with Lord Rose, who when he came before this committee said that if we left the European Union, wages for the lower paid would actually go up?
Well, it's a fact. I mean, it's supply and demand. I think, reading back for our old economic book, that when the Black Plague came along, the Black Death, workers' wages went up 40% the following year. There's no surprise that if you've got a lack of supply, then prices go up. So I would say that to contra the fact that sterling may drop and prices may go up, I think wages would almost certainly rise.
But even George Osborne hasn't yet suggested we'll get the Black Death if we don't remain in the European Union. That may be what's coming in the next few weeks.
Supply and demand, that if you don't have workers, wages go up.
I think where we differ from Stuart Rose, Lord Rose, of course, is that we think that would be a good thing if domestic wages were to rise. And, of course, George Osborne also thinks that's a good thing, so they clearly differ there.
I don't believe the minimum wage is a living wage, and I think this is key to the problem.
And I think what we're seeing from the rallies that we've been holding up and down the country is that actually working class people have realised that the impact of uncontrolled, unsustainable immigration from the EU into this country is that there is a significant suppression of wages. And people are understandably very, very upset about that.
And do you recall the figure from the Treasury's report of how many will come in between 2030 as part of their economic forecast?
3
million.
3 million.
3 million. I think that report's worth looking at a bit more because it also assumes that there's no saving from regulation at all. Do either of you think that is realistic?
Well, I think, as I answered to you, I think there is a saving. I think it's probably overblown at 33 billion. It's somewhere between the two.
It also assumes as one of the major costs that we would apply unilateral tariffs at the same level as the common external tariff to EU products coming into the UK. Could that possibly be reasonable? Was anybody in the Leave campaign suggesting that we do that?
I mean, let's be honest, it was a work of fiction designed to achieve a particular aim to suit George Osborne's requirements. No credible economist has looked at it, as far as I'm aware, and said that actually it's a work of art.
Do you recall what the Chancellor said on the 17th of May 2010 when he set up the Office for Budget Responsibility.
I'm assuming you can.
I can, yes. He said, again and again, the temptation to fiddle the figures, to nudge up a growth forecast here or reduce a borrowing number there, to make the numbers add up, has proved too great. And that is a significant part of the reason for our current problems. I believe the public should be able to trust official forecasts for the economy. I want independent forecasts to become the norm. Why do you think he's gone back to Treasury forecasts?
I certainly don't trust anyone that's doubled the national debt in 6 years. That would be my starting position. Outrageously true.
I wonder
Is that
if
not
I...
true? Have I missed something? That's not. Will you say it's not true? It's true.
Half the deficit. The deficit.
I didn't say that. I said double the national debt.
Because you know how this works.
I think
exactly how it works.
I think that's slightly wandering away from this particular argument.
Oh dear.
Of our, but you also touched briefly on interest rates, and again I'm going to ask you to recall things from your memory. The exchange rate mechanism, European activity, put interest rates up to 15%. So the only time when our involvement with the EU has had an effect on interest rates, it's been to put them up to a level that bankrupted thousands of businesses and put hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes. Is that a fair? Yeah. Thank you. So can I now come on to how we might leave and what Leave.eu's view is, because there's been some speculation about a second referendum. Indeed, most EU countries, when they don't vote the way the establishment want, it gets told that they've got to vote again. Do you think that is a realistic possibility? Even if you don't want it, do you think that there is a chance that we may be forced to vote again?
I think everyone seems to be viewing this as an event, which I think it isn't. It's a process. Where I differ with Vote Leave and some of the senior Conservative politicians is I think we should invoke Article 50 almost straight away. And we go into negotiations for 2 years over the outcome. And I think, it's as straightforward as that.
John Cunliffe, who appeared before this committee, who was UPREP, said that what he thought should be done was we should spend a limited amount of time preparing the way to exercise Article 50, to see the lie of the land, allow tempers to cool a bit. You broadly in agreement?
Yes,
with
I mean, when I say immediate, I don't mean straight away, but within but within a sort of,
but by Christmas.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
I think if the British public have voted out, they don't want the equivocation of the politicians then starting to reframe it.
And we don't want to be treated like Ireland, Denmark, France, Holland, and be forced to
I think, let's be clear, Article 50 starts the process. And yes, there's a reference to 2 years, but there's no need for it to take 2 years. It could take shorter with the right negotiating team, and I think that is a key part of post-Brexit vote, is actually who is going to represent the UK's interests. And what I think is absolutely fundamental is that it should not be people who have advocated to remain with the sort of scaremongering that they've done. So in the nicest possible way, the last people who should be negotiating a Brexit is the Prime Minister, the Chancellor or the Foreign Secretary. It needs a team of, in my view, the best negotiators from the world of business. The suggestions that we shouldn't Brexit because we haven't got enough civil servants to negotiate a free trade agreement. I mean, that is one of the most feeble, weakest arguments to do with, for the future of our national sovereignty. We haven't got some negotiators. I mean, really.
Well, the OECD forecast out today, and I completely agree with your view of these international bodies, which consistently get things wrong, and very often catastrophically so. You're quite right to point out they didn't predict the crisis in 2008, and so on. The OECD assumes we will get no free trade deals with anybody until 2023. That would require spectacularly inept negotiation.
Yeah. Well,
so it's just not credible. It's
completely uncredible.
The average European Union trade deal takes 7 years because you've got to get 28 people to all agree on the same thing, which is virtually impossible with the vested interests they've got at play. One country actually negotiating by itself is actually in a better position to do it because it doesn't have to coalesce all these ridiculous vested interests.
Absolutely.
It's interesting, isn't it, that a country the size of Switzerland can have free trade agreements with a cumulative GDP of, I believe, 4 times the cumulative GDP of the free trade agreements that the EU's got. And I think we should remember, you don't have to have a free trade agreement in order to very successfully trade with another country. For example, we have a greater trade surplus in services with the United States of 350 million people, with whom we do not have a free trade agreement, than we have our surplus in services with the EU of 500 million people. So you don't need trade agreements in order to very successfully trade with other countries.
As a good example as well, because World Trade Organization has brought tariffs down, it's almost a kind of a rounding error in the equation. So, you know, you look at the potential tariffs we would face in Europe with our products, it's only 2/3 of the cost of the membership. As I was explaining to Mrs. Reeves, the currency has moved 10% in the last 3 months, which is twice the size of that tariff. So the biggest moving part is your exchange rate, not the potential tariffs.
And the exception on that is, of course, food, where there are still very high external tariffs from the European Union, which is the major additional cost to households in this country of our membership.
On an ethical basis, they destroy farmers in Africa and other people with this kind of policy.
Thank you very much.
Mark.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can I carry on trade and what trade will look like after Europe? It's very interesting, Mr. Tice, you were discussing with Mr. Wigmore the potential of and I think you made actually a very valid point. I mean, as you know, I disagree with your end objective in this whole thing, but I do think you made a very important point, which is to use the argument that we don't have anybody who knows how to negotiate a trade deal as a reason not to leave as completely ludicrous. And I do accept that, but nonetheless it does actually raise a very, very important point. I mean, we have not negotiated a trade deal in this country for many, many years. And whilst it might be nice to have some business leaders who come in and do this stuff for us, at the end of the day, why would a business leader give up running a business to come along and spend years, or months, who knows, negotiating a trade deal? So it is an important point as to what we can achieve with what we've got. And what I would like to understand from you is what you envisage we can potentially get. So on your website, I don't expect you to remember all this, but I'll read it to you. You say the remaining EU member states will seek a trade agreement with the UK that seeks to maintain the same level of free exchange of goods, services and capitals as is the case today. So basically, kind of broadly speaking, the same as we've got now. And you go on to say that the vision for Brexit is that the UK would decide on its own laws to regain control of important issues such as our borders, again, which is kind of integral to this whole thing. The problem is, of course, you're now introducing a level of discrepancy. In order to have the same deal with Europe, it would be understandable, the EU rather, would be understandable if we had the same agreements with them in terms of other things. And yet, what I would be interested from the two of you is how you see us being able to get exactly the same trading relationship when we remove, for example, something like the free movement of labour across borders, which would in effect make us have a better deal with Europe than the Europeans have with themselves. How are we going to achieve that?
Well, I think that was part of my question to Mr. Rees-Mogg, that the tariffs that you're talking about that when you trade into Europe are less than 2/3 of our current membership fee. So effectively, it's not a huge issue.
But we're not talking about tariffs. So you're talking about potentially getting an identical trade deal. But so essentially, if you like, a Norwegian type of model without the free movement of labour.
Yeah, I mean.
But how do we get that?
But that's what I'm saying, that the financial consequences are not particularly severe. I mean, the USA trades into Europe, China, Canada, all sorts of
Okay, so what you're
people.
saying is we won't get the same trading relationship with Europe.
I said
the
worst case based scenario, if you didn't, would still not be bad, but of course you would do a better deal. I mean, we're running a massive...
No, but your website, just to be clear, the website does, you do say the remaining EU member states will seek a trade agreement with the UK that seeks to maintain the same level of free exchange of goods, services and capital.
Germany exports twice as much to us as they do to us.
So what your site is saying is that you're going to have a non-tariff trade agreement with Europe.
Yes, I think that would emerge extremely rapidly.
So you have a non. So this is my point.
Yeah.
You'll have a non-tariff trade agreement with Europe on
Yep.
goods and services, but so identical in every sense we've got in terms of the trade. But you also say on your side that we'll regain control of important issues such as our borders. So what you're essentially saying, taking those two statements together, is the deal we will have with Europe will not only be better for us, but it'll be better than the deal the Europeans have amongst themselves.
That's rather the point of it, I think, yes.
Well, how are you going to achieve it?
Well, yeah.
Well, I think the point is, at the end of the day, we import substantially more goods from the European Union than we export to them. So we have the negotiating leverage because it's more in their interests to continue to export the 1.2 million German cars and others. So it's in everybody's vested interests to negotiate agreement, and it's in everybody's vested interests from all countries to do it quickly. So I think that's the first point. Our surplus, of course, is with services.
I'm going to ask you to unpack that statement, because this is an argument that's used frequently by the Brexiteers, is that because we have such a good trading relationship with Europe, they will happily do all of this. I can't remember the numbers off my top of my head of what our exports are as a percentage of our GDP, but I mean our total exports to the EU are £148 billion a year.
It's 12%.
12% of our GDP. I mean, the reality of it is total trade with Europe to the UK is less than 10%.
No, it's not. The government figure in their pamphlet was completely wrong.
Well, then what is it?
16%.
Okay, but nonetheless, it's still a very small part.
Well, no,
Trade amongst
Well,
Europe.
I think it's really important.
But
These are
do
people
you
and
think-
jobs we're talking about. It's not percentages.
I appreciate that. But are you saying that Europe is going to turn around, the EU, if I refer to Europe as interchangeable with the EU, but the EU are going to turn around and say for a 16% of their total trade externally with one country, they will give a better deal than anybody else in the world has got, including members of the EU.
Why is it a better deal than anyone else in the world has got?
Well, who else has got tariff-free trade?
Well,
I've just told you tariffs are a very minor point. Of
No. Tariff-free. Tariff-free.
Yes, I know, but it's a minor consideration.
But the point, yes, but you can't it's like trying to nail jelly to a wall.
No, it is, and I'll
sometimes,
give you a very clear answer.
But you either have tariffs or you don't have tariffs. Your website is suggesting we have a tariff-free deal and a free movement of people free deal. That doesn't exist for anybody. Whenever I keep trying to press you on that, you say, yeah, but tariffs don't matter. Actually, they do, because you're avoiding answering questions. So who has a zero tariff deal on goods and services and without free movement?
Well, let's be very clear. The Canadian agreement that is currently going through, as I understand it, that is 98% tariff-free on goods.
But it doesn't include services.
But there are no tariffs on services.
No, sure, but none.
Okay, well,
but it's
hang on, you
for
can't
us.
take that. There are no tariffs on services. There are barriers to entry on services, and let's be very clear: the single market, after 20 years, is far from a non-tariff barrier-free zone. There are still huge barriers to the market and services, and indeed. There are people who suggest that actually many EU countries have no interest in removing those barriers to services.
So Mexico has one.
Give the man a better job, or at least a bonus. But it's so that includes services. So there's no big thing to say.
I mean, services is a good example. Okay, that it's not a single market in services. Why do we keep saying this?
No, but it's a developing single market, and we're committed to deep
developing.
How long have we got to wait? I mean, we've waited 20 years, and it's still not a single market in services.
But if we're
surprise,
outside, we
surprise.
have an infinite amount of period to wait.
Surprise, surprise.
Okay, let me ask some other questions, because again, there's...
Can I just go back to the question you asked us? I wanted to be clear on that the worst case scenario of no deal...
By the way, Mexico, just to finish up on that point, my mental gears have been working to catch up. But Mexico is a very, very small economy. We're talking about the fifth biggest economy on the planet. It's all very well talking
It kind of makes the point that
we are incredibly important.
But we would have more leverage than Mexico as the fifth largest economy in the world.
Yeah, but they've got more to lose in the EU.
We're their biggest single export partner. And Germany has a surplus in goods that it exports to us of over 30 billion a year. And we all know what Germany says...
27.278 billion.
Right. It's a massive number. And... bye-bye. Let's be clear. Germany has a huge surplus in goods to the UK, and we all know that what Germany says goes in terms of what happens within the European Union.
But Ireland has a 10 billion deficit with the UK. Luxembourg 1.3. I mean, look, admittedly, I grant you these things, but the point is, but hang on, because the point is that you've got to negotiate a trade deal that satisfies all these people, all these countries. So you're quite right. Germany has a very, very huge incentive to negotiate the best possible trade deal it can get. But Ireland has the opposite incentive. So now what you're proposing is that we're going to negotiate a trade deal with the whole of Europe. I mean, look, you make a very, very good point. If Britain by itself can go to the rest of the world and negotiate a trade deal with Mexico, so we can negotiate a trade deal with Mexico, and it'll be 27 times easier, 28 times easier to do it, because we don't have to think about 27 other countries. That's absolutely right. But this deal you're proposing that we're going to have with Europe is negotiated with 27 countries, and you're right about Germany. Well, you weren't wrong about the number, but you're right about the principle. But that same principle applies to Ireland, and Ireland will want to have the opposite type of deal because it has a different set of interests. Ireland has a huge interest in financial services. Germany has a huge interest in the auto industry. We've got to get all of them happy. And you're talking about the fact that we have this very significant, nearly half of our exports go to.
In a minute, you've got to allow us to ask questions, and then we've got to leave you to try and answer the questions as someone else was explaining to you earlier this afternoon how it works. Carry on, Mark. Get to your question.
The point is that our single biggest trading partner has exactly the problems that you've suggested that creates a problem for us negotiating with the rest of the world, that there are going to be 27 nations with very, very diverse interests that will eventually want to come up with a solution. So I think it's 48% of our trade is with Europe, so it's a very, very significant amount. That is very important to our economy, and you're suggesting that we will easily create a trading arrangement which will be a zero, which actually will be a better trading relationship than Germany's trading relationship with France. And I defy you to come up with an answer which is plausible, which refutes that, or who confirms that.
The two parts of the question. The second one, that no one, the Irish are interested in financial services, Germans in cars, all the rest of it is the very single reason that the EU is lousy at doing trade deals around the world. Because when they try to do a trade deal, they can't agree on anything.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And you're talking. I agree with you. But you're now talking about us doing a trade deal on 48% of our trade with an organisation which you say is lousy.
But I'm pointing out to you the cost of the tariffs, because the tariffs have generally come down worldwide, is almost a rounding error in the calculation. Well, something like 7 or 8 billion. Against trade of 300 million globally.
Let me talk about tariffs. If you look at a WTO tariff, I think the WTO base tariff is 2.4%. Okay.
Yep.
So our exports to the EU 148 billion, imports from the EU 226. This is a goods of 226 billion. So you have a 78 billion deficit. But anyway, you look at those goods tariffs, that comes to actually £9 billion. If you look at these numbers, so actually this is the if you like the most basic cost of the EU. If you look at, so I've taken these from the Times, I know there's lots of different sets of numbers on this, because it's as good as any. Our 2015 contribution to the EU was £17.8 billion, of which £4.9 billion is a rebate, so that never leaves the country, but obviously comes back onto the books. 4.4 billion of cap and payments and structure fund payments, 1.4 billion of contributions to companies and grants to companies. That's a 7.1 billion pound, if you like. We spend 7.1 billion pounds buying that free trade agreement.
Well, I think the net number's 8.5. If you take your numbers.
This one out. So hang on, 17.8 minus
4.9 minus 4.5.
Well, it comes
to 8.5. And can I just clarify?
Hang on.
You did pick me up on figures earlier. It's not 48% of our exports, it's 44% according to the ONS. And that is before, very importantly, that is before what's called the Antwerp Netherlands distorting effect, where our exports go... I'm sorry to be technical, but
it's a very important point.
Okay, that is exports that go straight through the Netherlands or Antwerp to the rest of the world. When you deduct that number, our exports to the rest of the EU are probably somewhere in the mid-30s.
Fair enough, but would you not accept that they are nonetheless our biggest trading
Yes,
partner?
and we are theirs. And that's why it's in everybody's vested interests
to get this
right
Absolutely.
and to do it quickly.
Okay, but just getting back to this
I think
17.8. Well, hang on, let me just finish the point. The 17.8 billion minus the stuff that comes back comes to somewhere around 7 or 8 billion. That's against tariffs of 9 billion. So actually, but what's interesting about this, of course, is the government is spending the money, whereas it is the consumer that potentially will be suffering. So actually, what exiting the EU would do would be transferring a cost to the government, which comes out of taxpayers' funds, so that's spread evenly amongst everybody, whereas it will then be directly attributed to those consumers who buy European goods in the high street, and also those businesses that are selling goods into Europe.
In the unlikely event of a tariff situation.
But why is it unlikely?
Well, it's very unlikely.
Why?
Because it's not in anybody's interest. It's just not in anybody's interest. And I think the simple way through it, the simple way through it, the way that business people would address this is to say, tell you what we'll do, we'll impose zero tariffs on the European Union, and then it's up to the European Union to decide whether or not it wishes to unilaterally impose tariffs on us. Well, frankly, if it did that, it would look just spiteful and revengeful.
We choose what we want to do in terms of tariffs,
Yes.
and Europe chooses what it wants to do in terms of tariffs. A negotiating deal, I mean, you talked about Mexico having a zero-free tariff, and again, I will go and have a look at that and find out a bit more about it. But nonetheless, the chances of this happening straight away are very, very remote. Look, you may be right, because we don't know what's going to happen. It is entirely possible you're right, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Well, I think
it's going to take some time for this to be negotiated. For reasons you've argued, is why we should leave the EU, because the EU can't negotiate quick deals.
I think you have to look at what is in the best long-term interest of the country. And, and I don't dispute that there will be short-term pain of leaving. I don't dispute that.
What effect do you think that's going to have on families?
In what way?
Well, we know that families, households, are very highly leveraged at the moment. They have been higher leveraged, but as you've talked about asset bubbles. We saw in the lead up to the financial crisis, household debt as a percentage of household income increased from 100% to 175%. That number is absolutely fixed at about £1.45 trillion. Nothing's changed, but of course household income has gone up. Households are vulnerable to a whole load of different potential factors that might affect them. There's a number which you will have heard, which is somebody's come up with a figure of 3 million people will lose their jobs if we come out of Europe. I agree that's nonsense. I agree that's completely rubbish. But what that number does reflect is 3 million jobs that have a relationship with Europe in one way or the other. And to an extent, those jobs may be at a little bit extra risk as we go through this short-term pain, which you've agreed. Those jobs could be at a little bit of extra risk. We've also had a discussion with Rachel Reeves a bit earlier, talking about what happens in the event of us coming out. We've already seen fluctuations in the currency, and the currency seems to be following actually the opinion polls of whether we're in or out of Europe. The key point is, if you look back to the 2014 Bank of England stress test, they create a scenario where something precipitates a crisis in confidence, if you like, in the economy. And one of the outcomes of this is you see sterling collapsing. As a result of that, because exports don't grow as quickly as imported inflation hits the economy, the Bank of England has to respond by rising interest rates, and rising interest rates reasonably quickly, reasonably fast. Now, the modern neutral interest rate is expected to be something in the region of 2.5% to 3.5%. So let's say it goes to 2.5%. You're now picking up the cost to households of a doubling of the cost of their mortgage. And that's quite a significant problem to households. That's what you're suggesting is an acceptable short-term pain. And I think it's You said it was acceptable to have short-term pain. That's what I'm defining what the pain looks like.
Well, I don't agree with your definition. I mean, as we said earlier, there is no link between being a member of the European Union and our interest rates, which are set by completely different factors.
No. That's not what I said at all.
You just said that mortgage rates were going to go up if we left the EU.
No, I didn't say that. I said that there would be we both agree there could be short-term effects in the markets and short-term knock-on effects. What I've done is played out a scenario which was put forward by the Bank of England in the 2014 stress test, where it looks at something that precipitates a lack of confidence in the economy, which can then take on a number of a number of implications in terms of a tightening of credit, in terms of problems with the housing market and all the rest of it. But the point is that if you see a sustained pressure on sterling, and this is a hypothetical situation, but this is what can happen, if you see a sustained pressure on sterling because of a lack of confidence in the UK economy, because we've come out of things. Now, I know it's a chain reaction, but it's important that you can play these things out, or you can see how these, you can war game these things. You then see a collapse in sterling, you then import inflation before you boost your exports. You're right, exports could be boosted, but you could import inflation quicker because of the short-term effect. And the Bank of England's only response can be to rise interest rates in order to counteract that.
If you don't mind me saying so, it's just a ludicrous supposition.
Well, it's not, because it's a 2014.
I mean, I could sit here and say, well, the current construct of the euro is ripping itself to pieces. The currency of the euro will collapse and sterling will rise. I mean, you can put any scenario you like.
By your own admission, it's a war game, and I think that's an extreme theory, which is totally implausible.
But can you see a situation?
Not going to happen.
I mean, but the starting point of this discussion is that we both agreed that there could be short-term pain, and what I'm trying to do is to define what short-term pain could possibly look like. What you're not doing is saying what you think short-term pain would look like, and it's up to you to be honest.
There's pain remaining inside the European Union.
Yeah, but at least it's quantifiable pain. Coming
outside
is
unquantifiable. It's not. I mean, let's be very clear. The one thing in this referendum...
Before we get on to that, what we're really asking, and you just heard the question, is what is the short-term pain in your fears of leaving? That's the question we've been asked.
Let's move from the word pain to the word uncertainty. Okay?
Pain was your word.
Pain is fine.
But, nothing... Let's be clear. With our relationship with the European Union, nothing changes until we sign a new agreement. So it's not like something's changed the following day.
That's not true, actually. If you vote Article 50, you start the process of coming out. That's
yes,
separate from
and you've got 2 years to negotiate a new agreement. And you've then got the option, you can either agree to extend it, or you then move on to WTO tariffs. So it's not true to say that immediately the following day. I think, and the benefit of serving Article 50 is that you actually reduce the period of uncertainty because you start the negotiating period with serious earnest.
Can I just ask one question? We talked about
quick, because we'll have a vote at 27 minutes past, and I'm not intending to.
Dominic, just on the services point, because we haven't discussed any of the services. We have a £17 billion a year surplus with Europe on services. This is kind of quite an important point. I mean, clearly, you would agree that there's a potential problem with Europe would have non-tariff restrictions on us having services. But do you, Dominic Cummings last week came up with a comment that single market in services will be deeply destructive for Great Britain. Do you think that's right, or?
Number one, I don't think there is a single market in services.
No, but
so
we're trying to work towards nonetheless, I mean, there's a huge number of banks, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan,
banks will locate themselves wherever they want. They just open a branch wherever they like.
So you're not worried about the banking, about the attrition to the UK, the London centre.
In fact, it's very protectionist. If you take the industry I'm in, insurance. Technically, you can passport from Gibraltar to the UK. If you try and passport to France, you can technically do it, but they suddenly hit you with a withholding tax on premiums. They find another way to nail you. So the culture of European financial services is deeply protectionist.
And I do think someone like Goldman Sachs, talk about track record. They said we should join the euro.
Okay,
but it's really important.
These are good debating points, but they're a very long way from trying to establish whether there's some substance to the passporting point that we've just been discussing.
There is no single market in financial services. There won't be one because there's a protectionist position.
I want to take you back, Mr. Tice, to I'm going to be questioning on because another colleague particularly wants to come in, and I just want to clarify one point. And it's a point of detail, but it's a reflection. It's the same point I've been making on and off throughout the whole hearing, and I regret to say it's a problem with all three campaigns, and probably, although we haven't yet established that, with government figures as well. We'll see about that in due course. What is your estimate of the Rotterdam-Amsterdam effect?
Well,
Rotterdam-Antwerp effect?
So Global Britain, which has been carrying out research for over 20 years on the EU and recommending to leave, it's a very reputable research house led by Ian Milne and Ewan Stewart. They believe that it goes from 44% down into the mid to high 30s.
Well, hang on. A moment ago you said the mid-30s.
Yes.
Now
Well,
it's
no one knows, but their estimate is the mid to high 30s.
No, it's the mid to high 30s. So we're talking about something at least 5%.
Yes, well, if you go from 44 down to, let's say, 38, then yes, that's 6%.
That's
a significant. That is a significant.
I'm trying to find the highest number that's still in the 30s. It must be at least 5. That's all I'm doing.
Yeah,
I'm just taking what you're saying to me.
Fair enough.
And if I may say so, it's already altered a bit from when you last presented it to the committee, just only a few minutes ago when it was described as
I don't think it's altered. I use one end of the range and there's another end of the range, but.
Well, Andrew Dilnot, who's the chairman of the UK Statistical Authority, estimates the effect at around 2%. In fact, he's recently given evidence saying that in his view it's so small as to be scarcely measurable. I just point that out. I would suggest at first blush that I would be more likely to take notice of that than other research. They get their numbers wrong from time to time and they haven't had always a great track record, but on the whole, even weak though it is, sometimes it tends to be better than most other statisticians. So I do think we need great care with these figures, and I think it's helpful that you have at least identified a source, and if you are using the figure in your published documentation, I think it's extremely important that you should make sure that you source what you're talking about.
We can absolutely check our sourcing. I think most of it is sourced. But
and maybe have a look at this recent evidence. I don't know whether it was in the last few days. I think it might well have been from the ONS. George Caravan.
Thank you for a very entertaining afternoon, gentlemen. Mr. Banks, you said that the EU is lousy at negotiating trade deals. What benchmark would you use?
I think
justifying.
You mentioned countries like Switzerland and Iceland that managed to do. I mean, I think there's one in particular, isn't it? Switzerland did it in under 10 months with one particular country. The core time-wise. I mean, the core of the problem is trying to get 28 different countries.
I appreciate it. If I told you that, as best as our excellent research team over here can estimate, the EU has negotiated 53 preferential trade deals with individual countries or blocks, which is more than any other country or trading group that we can find. On that measuring stick, it does very, very well.
But if you look at, as I said earlier, if you look at the cumulative GDP of those, it is significantly less than a small country like Switzerland. So on that basis, it does very poorly.
I'm more than willing to admit that individual small countries might have negotiated this or that. But in terms of what is the world's largest trading bloc, largest GDP grouping, it's negotiated the largest number of preferential trade deals. I think any reasonable person might say that on that basis, the EU does quite well in negotiating.
Well, actually, it's not the world's largest trading bloc. When you take out the UK, it's smaller than the US.
I'm sure if you take out X, Y, and Z, it will be smaller than it is at the moment.
We are advocating Brexit.
Okay, fair enough. Right. Barack Obama, let's move on. I noticed, Mr. Rice, devotee of your tweets, Mr. Tice, you said that actually Obama helped Brexit. British people don't like being bullied by dodgy establishment peddling lies. What lies was it President Obama told?
Well, I think that people recognise that what he was doing was trying to represent the interests of the United States. And if you
look at, that's what he's paid for.
Yeah, but if you look at, you look at lots of those U.S. Treasury former secretaries, for example. Parts of the establishment, many of them employed by Goldman Sachs.
I asked President Obama, what were the lies that you were referring to?
The first one, as I referred to earlier, frankly, is that we go to the back of the queue, when actually other very senior politicians, Ted Cruz and such like, are saying that actually, we could go. Ted Cruz said in the last 24 hours, we could go to the front of the line.
Mr. Cruz isn't president.
No, but he is standing to be president.
Well, okay. Who is it negotiates? Who is it ultimately? Who is it ultimately in the United States constitutional setup that decides whether to accept a trade treaty or not?
Congress.
Right, which is made up of 50 states, represents 50 states, all of whom have different individual needs, requirements, self-interest. So you could argue, in fact, the United States is set up very much the same as the EU. So when it comes to actually a UK out of the EU, trying to negotiate a trade deal with America, it's exactly the same situation that you're saying you disagree with, you worry about the EU. Here you have 50 vested interests in 50 states, and you have to get a trade deal, which is why it will take, in President Obama's words, 5 to 10 years.
As I said earlier, we don't have to do a trade deal with the US. The last thing we should be doing is a trade deal called TTIP. As I said earlier, we have a bigger surplus in services with the US, with whom we don't have a trade deal, than we do in services with the EU. Trade deals are not the be-all and end-all.
You've got to, I think, realise as well that trade deals are one thing. People trade. It's people and companies. It's not governments and laid down rules. That's why, in point of fact, that we're actually trading with America really nicely. We've got a surplus. It's growing. We're exporting more. So this kind of political idea that you have to have all these deals is just not right.
Well, that's fine. I'm glad to take your opinion. But it does seem a little bit at odds with the Leave.eu website, which makes a very big play, and I'll quote, "Imagine having greater influence over our global trade so that we can do our own deals."
We can.
Yes, we can.
Right, well, which is, you can see, either deals are important as a priority for Brexit or they're not. Which is it?
The word is can. So if it's advantageous to us, then we can do them. But we are in control of our own destiny. That is the fundamental difference.
You can do the negotiations, you can't deliver the deals.
And a deal is a two-sided thing.
Indeed,
Both sides.
which is why we come back to the fact that President Obama has said that go to the end of the queue, it will take 5 to 10 years to negotiate. So
and others in the States are not saying that. He's not going to be president for very long. His trade representative used to work in Brussels. I mean, we can go on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but I mean, I think a reasonable person might presume that the judgment of the President of the United States is a bit different from the doorman in the bar around the corner. But we can always choose somebody. But I think what the President of the United States says, I mean, as it happens, I actually think that he didn't have any right to come here and tell British electors what to do.
Which is why I used the word
very critical.
Which is why I used the word bullying.
But that doesn't blind me to the fact that the President of the United States said that, and I think he represents a view because actually, if there is a nation, a large trading nation, which has had a very tough position, even with its so-called friends and allies, when it comes to trading issues, it's the United States. So I hardly think that we're looking, if we come out of the EU, I hardly think we're back in a 19th century situation of free trade and quick deals. I think we are in a different situation altogether. And I think a reasonable person has the right to ask you, are you not being rather over-optimistic in what can be achieved in a Brexit situation?
Well, I think I go back to what I said before, that the World Trade Organization has brought tariffs down to such a point that these deals may be advantageous, they may not be. Our trade with America is rising quite nicely. We've got a surplus and it's growing. You don't have to have a free trade deal to trade.
Absolutely, appreciate that. But I mean, if we're talking about future economic growth, which is very much tied to trade and expansion of global trade, we all know that the Doha round has stalled. Doha round of WTO trade has stalled for the last couple of decades, precisely because we have removed the easy bit, which is getting down the tariffs on manufactured goods, and we've moved to trying to remove the tariffs, the internal hidden barriers on trade in services. And we know that that's the most difficult thing to do. And as you've pointed out, we're by no means have created a free market in services in the EU, despite having set up an apparatus to do it. So in that circumstance where the whole world is finding it difficult to progress, removing trade barriers, non-tariff barriers for services, what is your evidence that the UK, coming out of the group which has had the most success in negotiating trade deals, will be better off at being able to achieve further bilateral deals in removing non-tariff barriers, so to get the economic growth and the productivity growth, which is what the UK depends on for the future.
The European Union is unique in the sense that it requires the kind of political union of its members as well as the economic members. So the groups
Well,
you're
no,
talking...
you agreed America is in the same
Well,
situation.
I know, but the groups you're talking about do not have have political union. So America, as far as I'm aware, is not merged with Canada and Mexico. So it's a much looser grouping of countries. So therefore, when it's negotiated, like, it's kind of trying to do things, it's not quite the same, is it?
No, but we've already agreed that domestically inside the United States, for Congress to agree on a trade deal, he has to get 50 senators of 50 states, 100 senators of 50 states to agree. So it's in exactly the same situation. Once you move to large trading blocks, you're dealing with vast amounts of self-interest. You need patient negotiation, and you need scale. And taking the UK, the arguments, a reasonable person I think would say, taking the UK out of the EU, remove the scale that the UK, and the political clout the UK would have to negotiate.
I'm sorry, we just don't accept that. You've asked for evidence. I gave you the evidence earlier. A country like Switzerland has negotiated trade deals with a cumulative GDP way in excess of the European Union. So we simply don't accept that the European Union is successful at negotiating trade deals. And what the British people are really concerned about, actually, is the last thing they want is the European Union to negotiate a trade deal with the US called TTIP that is being done in secret with no transparency, that is going to benefit US multinational corporations to the detriment of UK workers' rights. That's what the UK workers are really, really concerned about. Because it's not in our control, because we've only got a 9% vote.
I happen to agree with you on that. But equally, if you went to many people in America, many American trade unions, they would tell you exactly the same thing.
But equally, as I said earlier, the thing that we're really good at, services, we have a very substantial service surplus with the US and no trade agreement. Trade agreements are not the be-all and end-all.
Yeah, but we've agreed that. But what we are looking in terms of the future, in terms of Britain's woeful productivity rate, we are talking about opening up UK to more trade, which I think is what you have clearly put as one of the key things in supporting Brexit on your website, which refers in large measure to the trade deals that we could engineer.
Yeah.
Right. If we need that trade access, apart from a reference to Switzerland, it seems to me that there's relatively little to suggest that the UK would have the scale to negotiate. So we take China, let's say the Chinese. I mean, Switzerland has a trade deal with China, but it's actually terribly one-sided. And in fact, there's actually, I mean, to be ridiculous about it, there's quite specific prohibitions on tariffs on the export of Swiss watches to China, because China is very, very capable of defending its own manufacturing base. So the question comes back. In a situation where the UK has removed itself from the EU and taken out of the major negotiations between the blocs, what negotiating power do you have apart from all these new businessmen you're going to bring in like yourselves? Who are going
Absolutely
to
massive, because we're the 5th largest economy in the world. You know, I mean, if Iceland, with 300,000 people, can negotiate a trade agreement with China, then the UK, with 65 million people, can absolutely negotiate a free trade agreement with China, if it's in our interest. But let's remember, the EU is China's biggest export partner, and there's no free trade agreement. It comes back to what I said earlier, that you don't have to have a free trade agreement to trade with it. And you picked up on productivity earlier. This is really important. There is a productivity conundrum as to why the UK economy is actually doing relatively well within the EU, and yet our productivity appears to be worse than countries like France. I would suggest to you that actually one of the reasons for that is because we've got an infinite supply of low-skilled labour from the EU, there is less incentive, and therefore wages have been, unfortunately, artificially suppressed. There is less incentive for UK businesses to invest in investment and capital that improves productivity. So you can't have it both ways.
I would actually argue it's the other way around, because the low investment and the low capital to worker ratio has been there since for 30 or 40 years. I put it the other way. I think business doesn't want to invest, or actually we have a set of fiscal incentives that prioritise investment in bricks and mortar rather than plant and machinery. And as a result, you have to fill the gap with cheap labour.
That's true.
But
let's agree on that.
But it's been exacerbated by the free movement of labour. Of course, it has.
We've given some interesting and occasionally some entertaining evidence. We're grateful to you for coming to see us this afternoon. That's not just a perfunctory remark, given how difficult it has been on occasion to get witnesses in this particular debate. We've managed to get our evidence in before the vote, so we won't need to recall you after it. And we look forward to receiving a good deal of written supplementary material. And we'd like that as soon as possible, please. Now, we recognise that you'll be under pressure, but so are we, in order to produce our report on the points that we've raised. And if you have any doubts about what those are, please get in touch with our staff.
A week, 2 weeks?
A week, I would say, a week will be about as long as we can manage. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
The proceeding has ended.